The private dining hall of the Grand Regency Hotel glowed with golden chandeliers and crystal glasses. A long mahogany table stretched across the room, set with silverware so polished it reflected the nervous faces of the businessmen seated around it. At the head of the table sat Mr. Kenji Takahashi, a Japanese millionaire whose fortune was whispered about in elite circles, but whose presence now made the room feel smaller. His tailored charcoal suit carried the understated elegance of old money, each thread speaking of generations of refinement. His eyes, sharp, calculating, but polite, studied the men across from him like a master chess player contemplating his next move. The air itself seemed expensive here, thick with the scent of imported orchids and aged whiskey. Crystal decanters caught the light, casting rainbow fragments across cream-colored walls adorned with oil paintings, worth more than most people's homes. This was a room where empires were built and fortunes decided with the stroke of a pen. Everyone knew this dinner was crucial. Takahashi had flown in from Tokyo for one night only, his private jet having touched down just hours before. The deal on the table was worth hundreds of millions, a joint venture in sustainable technology that could transform the entire city's economy. For the local executives, this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to catapult their companies into global prominence. But there was one problem, that none of their expensive educations had prepared them for. When the millionaire spoke, nobody understood him. Takahashi leaned forward, his posture relaxed yet commanding, speaking fluidly in Japanese. His tone carried warmth, even humor, the kind of conversational ease that spoke of generations of cultured upbringing. But to the businessmen seated before him, each carefully chosen word was nothing more than elegant gibberish. Kono puro jakuto wataniku ni non nika imi ga aru no deshu ka? He asked with genuine curiosity, his voice melodious and respectful. Asterisk, does this project have any real meaning? Any substance? Asterisk, the executives glanced nervously at one another, their confidence evaporating like morning mist. Beads of sweat formed on foreheads that had been powdered just hours before. Glasses of imported water were lifted with trembling hands and set down without being sipped. Forks tapped anxiously against bone china plates that cost more than a month's salary. Dotmer Coleman, the lead executive with silver hair and a reputation for closing impossible deals, forced what he hoped looked like a knowing smile. Yes, of course, he said vaguely, his voice pitched to high, though it was painfully clear he hadn't understood a single syllable. Takahashi paused, raising one perfectly groomed eyebrow. The silence stretched like a taut wire. He repeated himself, slower this time, his voice maintaining its calm authority, but carrying a note of insistence. That made the room feel smaller. Anotatochi wa honto ni kono shigoto ni kokoro o kamiti iru no deshu ka? Are you truly putting your hearts into this work? Again, blank stares. Again, the suffocating weight of incomprehension. The younger executives shifted in their leather chairs, expensive fabric creaking with their discomfort. One fumbled desperately with his phone under the table, fingers slick with nervous perspiration as he tried to pull up a translation app. But the signal inside the grand dining hall was frustratingly weak. blocked by thick stone walls and ornate metal fixtures. The app spun uselessly, a digital representation of their mounting panic. Another man, desperation making him bold, leaned toward Takahashi and began speaking loudly in broken English, as though raising his volume would somehow bridge the vast cultural canyon that had opened between them. Mr. Takahashi. Very good deal. Business. Yes. Much money. Success. Partnership. Yes. Yes. His words came out stilted and crude, like a child reciting poorly memorized lines. The contrast was jarring. His $1,000 suit and $20 vocabulary creating a cognitive dissonance that would have been comical if the stakes weren't so astronomically high. The millionaire's lips pressed into a thin line. Not offended, his upbringing was too refined for such displays, but certainly unimpressed. Disappointment flickered in his dark eyes like candlelight in a draught. Across the room, moving like a shadow among shadows, unnoticed by the powerful men wrestling with their linguistic inadequacy, a young waitress named Emily Carter adjusted the silver tray in her hands. She had been quietly refilling crystal glasses and replacing artisanal bread baskets. Her practiced movements so smooth and unobtrusive that she might as well have been invisible. Her black and white uniform was perfectly pressed, but clearly worn, the fabric soft from countless washings. Her name tag, slightly crooked, read Emily in simple block letters, a stark contrast to the ornate golden nameplates that would have adorned the businessmen's desks in their corner offices. But her heart pounded like a war drum as she listened, each beat echoing in her ears louder than the nervous laughter and clinking silverware. Because years ago, long before she wore this humble uniform, long before she learned to make herself invisible in rooms full of important people, Emily had studied Japanese in cramped night classes at the community college. She had dreamed then of traveling to distant shores, of becoming a cultural bridge between worlds, a translator who could open doors and hearts with equal skill. She had imagined herself walking beneath cherry blossoms in Kyoto, her voice helping to forge international partnerships and understanding. But life, as it often does, had pulled her in another direction entirely. Bills piled up like autumn leaves. Her mother's illness worsened with each passing month. And instead of studying abroad among temple gardens and bullet trains, she had taken the first job she could find, waiting tables at the Grand Regency Hotel. Now, as she moved silently between the marble columns and beneath the crystal chandeliers, her secret skill burned inside her like a trapped flame yearning for oxygen. She understood every word Takahashi was saying, every nuance, every cultural reference, every subtle question embedded in his seemingly simple statements. She wanted to speak up with an intensity that physically hurt. She wanted to help, to bridge this growing chasm of misunderstanding. But interrupting a table full of millionaires? That could cost her not just this job, but any hope of employment in the city's hospitality industry. Word traveled fast among the elite establishments. Her knuckles whitened as she gripped the tray tighter, fighting an internal battle between desire and survival. Emily Carter's life was nothing like the glittering chandeliers and marble floors of the Grand Regency. She lived in a cramped one-bedroom apartment above Chen's laundromat on the east side of the city, where the rent was cheap and the neighbors kept to themselves. The walls were thin as paper, painted a depressing shade of beige that had probably been optimistically called warm sand. In the rental listing, the heating was unreliable at best. A temperamental radiator that clanged and hissed like an angry ghost. During winter nights, she could see her breath in the air. The sound of industrial dryers below rumbled like distant thunder through her restless nights. A mechanical lullaby that had become the soundtrack to her diminished dreams. Her mornings began religiously at 5 a.m. with instant coffee. Not the artisanal blend served at the hotel, but the kind that came in bulk containers from the discount grocery store. She would stand at her small kitchen window, watching the city wake up while performing the same stretching routine she had learned from a library book on preventing server injuries. Her shifts at the hotel lasted 12, sometimes 14 hours, when special events demanded extra staff. By the time she stumbled home, her body ached in ways that made her feel decades older than her 25 years. Her feet throbbed, her back protested, and her hands bore the small cuts and burns that were the invisible badges of service industry work. Yet, despite bone-deep exhaustion that seemed to seep into her very soul, she often sat at her small desk, really just a card table she had bought second-hand, flipping through worn Japanese textbooks, whose pages had become soft as fabric from years of handling. The words and symbols that had once glowed bright with promise had become bittersweet reminders of a path not taken, dreams deferred but not quite abandoned, on particularly difficult nights. When the tips had been poor or a guest had been especially cruel, she would trace the kanji characters with her fingertip, whispering their meanings like prayers to a god who had stopped listening. Emily hadn't always been destined for a life of invisible service. At 18, she had been a star student, the kind teachers remembered years later with fond smiles and proud stories. She had been accepted into a prestigious language program abroad, a scholarship opportunity that would have taken her to Tokyo for a full year of immersive study. Her professors had admired her natural talent, often calling her the girl with an ear for languages, high praise from academics who had spent their lives studying the subtle music of human communication. Japanese had fascinated her from the first day she encountered it in high school. Not just the words, but the entire cultural ecosystem they represented. The poetry of Bash that could capture entire seasons in 17 syllables. The philosophy of Zen that found profundity in simplicity. The subtle honor embedded in every interaction, every bow, every carefully chosen phrase. Her plan had been beautifully simple. Study hard, graduate with honors, and work as a professional translator or cultural liaison. She had even allowed herself to imagine working at embassies, guiding international businesses through the delicate dance of cross-cultural negotiation, or perhaps teaching others to find the same magic she had discovered in language. She kept the acceptance letter in a wooden box beside her bed, along with printed emails from professors who had promised to write glowing recommendations, and brochures from the university in Tokyo, with pictures of students laughing beneath cherry blossoms. But life, she learned, was never as simple as plans drawn up by 18-year-old dreamers. Her mother fell ill during Emily's first year at community college, a heart condition that grew steadily worse despite doctors' reassurances. Bills mounted like storm clouds on the horizon, medical expenses, prescription costs, specialist consultations that insurance covered partially or not at all. Emily's part-time job at a local bookstore, which had once felt like a pleasant way to earn spending money while surrounded by stories, suddenly became a desperate necessity. But even working 30 hours a week while carrying a full course load, she couldn't keep pace with the crushing financial reality. When the landlord of their small house threatened eviction, Emily made the choice that would reshape the entire trajectory of her life. She quit her studies and took a full-time job waiting tables. The dream was folded away like a letter never sent, placed in that wooden box where it gathered dust and faded hope in equal measure. Working at the Grand Regency Hotel, Emily quickly learned the invisible rules that governed the service industry. Guests didn't care about who she was or what she could do beyond bringing them their meals promptly. And with a smile, to them, she was simply part of the hotel's fixtures, as unremarkable and interchangeable as the chairs they sat in or the forks they used. Her co-workers were friendly enough in the way that people thrown together by economic necessity often are. They shared complaints about difficult customers and management policies, celebrated small victories like good tip nights or successful shifts without major disasters, and generally looked out for one another in the countless small ways that made survival possible. But Emily never told them about her Japanese. She never mentioned the textbooks in her apartment or the dreams that still haunted her quiet moments. Why burden others with her losses? Why risk their pity or, worse, their incredulous laughter? There had been one incident early in her employment that taught her the value of invisibility. A French couple was struggling with a receptionist, their limited English causing visible frustration for both parties. Emily had stepped in without thinking, her college French flowing easily as she translated their concerns and helped resolve their problem. The couple had been effusively grateful, but her manager had pulled her aside later, his tone carrying the chill of professional disapproval. "You're here to serve tables, not to show off," he had said, his words cutting deeper than he probably intended. "The guests have concierge services for language issues. Your job is to smile and carry plates. That's what we pay you for." The humiliation had burned in her cheeks for hours afterward. That day, she decided to keep her abilities to herself, to play small, to blend into the background like wallpaper. It was safer that way. Safer to be overlooked than to risk being seen as presumptuous or ambitious beyond her station. But deep in her heart, in the quiet moments between sleep and waking, she knew it was only a matter of time before life would demand she step out of the shadows she had built around herself. When Emily walked into the Grand Regency's private dining hall that evening, she thought it would be just another shift in an endless series of identical shifts. Another night of carrying trays that seemed to grow heavier with each passing hour, smiling at guests who looked through her rather than at her, collecting tips that would barely cover her share of her mother's medical bills. The private dining room was reserved for only the most exclusive events, and Emily had worked here only a handful of times before. The guests were always different: oil executives, tech moguls, foreign dignitaries, but the script was always the same. She would move quietly, efficiently, invisibly, ensuring that important people could conduct their important business without distraction. But when she saw the Japanese millionaire, something stirred in her chest like a hibernating animal awakening to spring. She didn't recognize his face from newspapers or business magazines, but the way he carried himself, the subtle confidence, the respectful way he bowed his head when speaking, the careful attention he paid to every word, reminded her powerfully of the professors she had once admired in her language classes. And when she heard his voice, rich and cultured, speaking Japanese with the kind of fluency that suggested deep education and cultural grounding, it felt like a key turning in a lock she had welded shut years ago. His words weren't the tourist Japanese she occasionally heard from hotel guests, simple phrases about directions or restaurant recommendations. This was the language she had fallen in love with: complex, nuanced, weighted with cultural meaning and philosophical depth. She wanted to respond with an intensity that surprised her. She wanted to engage with his ideas, to match his sophistication with her own understanding. For a moment, she imagined herself sitting at that table as an equal, contributing to the conversation instead of simply observing it from the margins. But fear held her tongue like a physical force. Fear of job loss, yes, but also something deeper: fear of hope itself. Because if she spoke and succeeded, she would have to face the possibility that the dream she had buried wasn't really dead. And if she spoke and failed, she would confirm the fear that had haunted her for years: that her abilities were an illusion, her dreams nothing more than youthful delusion. Kenji Takahashi wasn't just another wealthy guest passing through the Grand Regency. He was a man shaped by contradiction, born into modest circumstances, but now commanding billions, raised with traditional Japanese values, yet operating in the ruthless world of international business. Honored for his success, yet searching for something that money couldn't purchase. Born in Kyoto to a family that valued culture over capital, Kenji had grown up surrounded by beauty that cost nothing and traditions that were worth everything. His father ran a small tea shop tucked between ancient temples, serving ceremony-grade matcha to locals and tourists who appreciated artistry over efficiency. His mother worked as a calligrapher, her brushstrokes preserving an art form that seemed increasingly irrelevant in the digital age. Money had always been tight in their household, but culture, the poetry of bash that could stop time with its precision, the philosophies of Zen that found infinity in grain of sand, the profound pride of heritage that connected them to centuries of refinement, had been abundant as rain in springtime. At 20, Kenji left Japan with nothing but a partial scholarship and determination that burned like incense in temple halls. He studied engineering and business with the single-minded focus that his father brought to tea ceremony, understanding that mastery required not just knowledge but wisdom, not just ambition but humility. Within 2 decades, through a combination of brilliant insight, relentless work, and ethical practices that set him apart in industries known for cutting corners, he had built a business empire spanning technology, sustainable energy, and global investments. To the financial press, he was a billionaire tycoon whose every move affected markets. To those who knew him personally, he was a man who still performed tea ceremony every morning, who never forgot the lessons learned in his father's small shop. The businessmen at the table that evening assumed Takahashi's refusal to speak English was arrogance, the kind of power play that wealthy men often employed to assert dominance. In truth, it was something far more sophisticated, a test designed to reveal character rather than capability. Too often in his business dealings, Kenji had walked into rooms where people nodded and smiled and agreed with everything he said, all while their eyes calculated how much profit they could extract from the association. He had grown weary of empty handshakes and shallow flattery, of partnerships built on greed rather than mutual respect. That night at the Grand Regency, he wanted something different. He wanted to see who would admit ignorance honestly rather than pretending to understand. He wanted to find someone willing to bridge cultural gaps with genuine effort, rather than assumptions. He wanted, above all, to discover whether authentic human connection was still possible in a world increasingly dominated by spreadsheets and profit margins. The deal on the table was indeed worth over $200 million, a joint venture in sustainable technology that could revolutionize energy production, while creating thousands of jobs and transforming the environmental profile of an entire region. But for Kenji, the numbers were secondary to the people behind them. He wasn't looking for investors who could quote market projections or partners who understood supply chain logistics. He was searching for individuals he could trust with something more valuable than money: his reputation, his values, the legacy he hoped to build. He didn't care how impressive their quarterly reports looked, or how many awards lined their office walls. What mattered was whether they listened with genuine attention, whether they respected cultural differences as strengths rather than obstacles, whether they possessed the humility to admit limitation and the wisdom to seek understanding. His words that evening weren't complicated business jargon or technical specifications. Instead, he spoke of simple, profound things, memories of his childhood, the lessons learned in his father's tea shop, the cherry blossoms that bloomed each spring in Kyoto like promises of renewal. Watashi no chichi wa itsumo imoshita, he said softly, his voice carrying the reverence reserved for cherished memories. Shinrai wa akane di kaukoto wa dekimosen. So wa kamochi di kasigana keriba naranai. My father always said that trust cannot be bought with money. It must be earned with heart. But as he looked around the table, he saw only blank stares masquerading as comprehension, empty smiles that fooled no one, nervous laughter that revealed their desperation rather than their confidence. These men were drowning in their own fear, too proud to admit they needed help, too arrogant to acknowledge their limitations. They embodied everything his father had warned him about. People who confused wealth with wisdom, who mistook position for character. Disappointment settled in his chest like winter fog. He had traveled thousands of miles hoping for meaningful dialogue. Yet here he sat surrounded by men who couldn't even acknowledge their most basic limitation. As he sipped his sake, carefully imported from a brewery near his childhood home, Kenji felt the familiar weight of isolation that accompanied great success. Perhaps, he thought with sadness that surprised him, authentic connection was indeed impossible in rooms like this. Perhaps the price of wealth was eternal loneliness, broken only by those who wanted something from him rather than offering something to him. The clinking of silverware had slowed to sporadic, nervous percussion. The businessmen's forced laughter had evaporated entirely, leaving behind a silence so dense it seemed to absorb light. Perspiration gleamed on faces that had been confident an hour earlier, and ties were loosened by fingers that trembled with barely controlled panic. Mr. Takahashi's expression remained unreadable, but those who knew how to read subtle signs, the slight tightening around his eyes, the way his posture straightened almost imperceptibly, would have recognized disappointment crystallizing into decision. He spoke again in Japanese, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being understood. Communication ga dikonakereba, shinrai no kiso wa arimasen. Asterisk, if we cannot communicate, then there is no foundation for trust. Asterisk, the words hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle. Not one person at the table understood their meaning, but everyone sensed their finality. Coleman tried once more to bluff his way through, his voice cracking with desperation. Yes, yes, very true. He chuckled weakly while dabbing his forehead with a napkin. That cost more than Emily's weekly salary. We absolutely agree, don't we, gentlemen? But Kenji's eyes had hardened into obsidian. The performance had gone on long enough. He placed his napkin neatly beside his plate and stood, his movement fluid and decisive. In Japanese, he spoke the words that would end everything. Arigatou gozaimashita. Koriaiju no jiken no ri wa dekimosen. Thank you very much. I cannot waste any more time, though they couldn't translate the words. The businessmen understood their implication with perfect, horrible clarity. He was leaving. Panic rippled through the room like a physical force. Deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Months of preparation and anticipation. Strategic partnerships that could have defined their careers for decades. Everything was dissolving before their eyes like sugar in rain. One executive nearly overturned his chair in his haste to stand. Mr. Takahashi, please, wait. We can arrange for a translator. We have services. His voice cracked with the desperation of a drowning man, reaching for driftwood. But Kenji shook his head slowly, his disappointment carrying more weight than anger ever could. The gesture was gentle, but final, like a doctor delivering terminal diagnosis with compassionate honesty in the corner of the room. Emily felt her chest constrict as if someone were slowly tightening a rope around her ribs. She recognized those final words, arigatou gozaimashita, and understood their devastating finality. He wasn't just ending the meeting. He was walking away from everything these people had worked toward. Not because he was cruel or capricious, but because they had failed the most basic test of partnership, honest communication. Her silver tray trembled in her hands. Her palms were slick with perspiration that had nothing to do with the room's temperature and everything to do with the war being fought. In her mind between safety and possibility, this was it. The moment that would define not just this evening, but potentially the entire remainder of her life. If she stayed silent, Takahashi would leave. The businessmen would curse their luck and perhaps blame their failure on cultural differences beyond their control. And Emily would return to polishing glasses and pretending her dreams had never existed. But if she spoke, asterisk if she revealed the secret she had guarded so carefully, she would be exposing herself to risks she couldn't calculate. Her manager's warning echoed in her memory like a funeral bell. You're here to serve, not to show off. If she interrupted this gathering of powerful men, she might be humiliated in ways that would follow her for years. If she failed to bridge this gap successfully, she would confirm every fear that had kept her silent. If she succeeded too well, she might find herself in situations she wasn't prepared to handle. Her dream had already been shattered once, its pieces sharp enough to cut her whenever she tried to reassemble them. Could she risk breaking it again? But as she watched Kenji gather his belongings with the careful dignity of someone who had hoped for connection and found only performance, she realized that silence would be the greatest risk of all. Because dreams deferred don't just disappear, they calcify into regret, hardening into the kind of bitterness that poisons everything it touches. And in 20 years, when she was still serving plates to people who looked through her, she would remember this moment, not as the time she tried and failed, but as the time she failed to try. She looked at Rosie, the head server, who was busy arranging wine bottles in the service area, completely unaware of the drama unfolding steps away. No one was going to give Emily permission to speak. No one was going to encourage her to take this leap. This choice was entirely, terrifyingly hers. Her hands stopped shaking, with movements more deliberate than any she had made in years. Emily set her silver tray down on the marble serving counter. Her chest rose and fell with one deep, centering breath, the kind her mother had taught her to take before piano recitals. When she was young, when performance anxiety could be conquered with oxygen and intention. Then, as the golden silence in the dining hall stretched toward its breaking point, Emily stepped forward into the light. Her voice, when it came, was soft but carried clearly in the acoustic perfection of the room. Not the tentative whisper of a servant, but the measured tone of someone who had something important to say. Sumimasen Takahashi-sama. The two words, "Excuse me, Mr. Takahashi," cut through the atmosphere like a temple bell, pure and resonant and impossible to ignore. Every head in the room turned toward her. Forks clattered onto china plates. Businessmen's jaws dropped in expressions of comic disbelief. Even the barely perceptible hum of the air conditioning seemed to pause in anticipation. Kenji Takahashi, halfway to the door, with his dignity intact and his disappointment carefully concealed, stopped as if he had encountered an invisible wall. Slowly, deliberately, he turned toward the source of the voice. Not the dismissive glance one might give to an interrupting servant, but the full attention of someone who had heard something unexpected and potentially significant. Emily's heart hammered against her ribs, but her voice remained steady as she continued in Japanese that was not just grammatically correct, but culturally appropriate, carrying the proper levels of respect and formality. Anata ga kengit iru koto wa kori goi ni suru koto yo orimosen. Asterisk what you're thinking. That's not what this means. The reaction was immediate and electric. The dining hall, which moments before had been suffused with the heavy atmosphere of failure and disappointment, now crackled with the energy of pure surprise. The businessmen sat frozen, their carefully constructed personas shattered by the impossible sight of their invisible waitress, speaking fluent Japanese to a man they couldn't even communicate with. One executive whispered in awe, She speaks Japanese." Another muttered, more to himself than anyone else, "How is that even possible?" But it was Kenji's response that transformed the very air in the room. His expression, which had been carefully neutral, the polite mask of a disappointed businessman, softened into something approaching wonder for the first time all evening. His lips curved into what was unmistakably a genuine smile. He took 3 steps back toward the table, his movement fluid and purposeful, like a master returning to a chess game that had suddenly become interesting again. "Anata no namiwa?" he asked, his voice carrying curiosity and something that might have been respect. Emily felt her throat tighten, but she answered with quiet dignity, "Watashi wa Emily Carter desu." "Emily Carter," Kenji repeated, as if testing the sound of it. Then, switching to English for the first time that evening, he asked, "Miss Carter, you speak with remarkable precision. This is not tourist Japanese. Where did you learn?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. This was her moment to explain herself, to justify her interruption, to prove that her voice deserved to be heard in this room of power and money. Emily hesitated for just a moment, then chose honesty over any attempt at self-aggrandizement. "I studied for years, Takahashi-sama. I dreamed of living in Japan, of building bridges between cultures. But life had other plans. Tonight was the first time I've used these words in a very long time." Her admission carried the weight of years of silence, of dreams deferred but not forgotten, of talents hidden but not lost. The executives sat frozen in their expensive chairs, watching their carefully planned evening transform into something entirely beyond their control or understanding. Their months of preparation, their detailed presentations, their strategic positioning, all of it rendered irrelevant by a waitress who had been invisible to them. Until this moment, Dotma Coleman found his voice first, though it came out as little more than a strangled whisper. "Wait, you mean she understood everything? All this time? While we were—" His voice trailed off as the full implications of their evening hit him like a physical blow. One younger executive leaned toward his colleague and whispered, barely audible, the whole time, "The key to this deal was carrying our bread baskets." Nervous laughter rippled through the group, the kind that comes when people realize how foolish they've been, when the gap between their self-perception and reality becomes impossible to ignore. But Kenji raised his hand in a gesture that instantly silenced them. His attention remained focused entirely on Emily, as if the other men in the room had become irrelevant to whatever was happening. For Emily, this moment felt like stepping out of a shadow she had inhabited for so long that she'd forgotten what sunlight felt like. She wasn't invisible anymore. She wasn't just the girl clearing plates and refilling water glasses. For the first time in years, perhaps for the first time in her adult life, she was the most important person in the room. She straightened, her shoulders, feeling something that had been dormant awakening within her. Her voice grew steadier, more confident, as she continued. "Mr. Takahashi, you came here seeking sincerity. These gentlemen tried to impress you with confidence. But what you deserve is honesty. If you'll permit me, I can translate for you, not just words, but meaning. Not just language, but intention." The offer was audacious. A waitress, offering to mediate between a billionaire and some of the city's most powerful businessmen. In any other context, it would have been presumptuous to the point of comedy. But something in her tone, in the careful respect with which she addressed him, in the obvious depth of her linguistic and cultural knowledge, made Kenji take her seriously. "Proceed," he said simply, settling back into his chair with the air of someone who had just discovered that the evening might be worth his time after all. And just like that, the fundamental dynamic of the room shifted like tectonic plates adjusting to new pressures. Emily became the bridge between two worlds, the translator not just of words, but of entire worldviews. Every question Kenji posed now flowed through her voice, each phrase carefully modulated to preserve not just meaning, but cultural context. When he asked about environmental impact, she didn't just translate the words. She conveyed his underlying concern for generational responsibility. When he inquired about local community involvement, she helped the businessmen understand that he was asking about values, not just marketing strategies. For the first time since the dinner began, real communication took place. The businessmen finally heard what Takahashi was actually asking. Not about quarterly projections or profit margins, but about the deeper questions that drove sustainable business, integrity, long-term vision, respect for both people and planet. And slowly, gradually, they began to realize that their evening had been failing not because of language barriers, but because they had been answering questions that weren't being asked, while ignoring the concerns that actually mattered. With Emily's translation revealing the true depth of Kenji's inquiries, they found themselves in a different kind of conversation entirely. One that challenged them to think beyond immediate returns, to lasting impact, beyond corporate success, to cultural responsibility. The transformation was remarkable to witness. Men who had seemed shallow and desperate when trying to navigate linguistic confusion revealed genuine knowledge and passion. When they finally understood what was being asked of them, Coleman, no longer sweating and stammering, began speaking thoughtfully about renewable energy infrastructure. Another executive shared detailed plans for community job training programs. A third outlined environmental restoration initiatives that went far beyond regulatory requirements. Emily found herself not just translating language, but facilitating understanding, helping each side recognize the values they actually shared despite their different cultural expressions. As the evening progressed and genuine dialogue replaced performative desperation, Kenji began to study Emily with increasing interest. Her translations were flawless. But more than that, they were insightful. She understood not just what he was saying, but what he meant. Not just what he was asking, but why he was asking it. When he mentioned his father's tea shop, she conveyed not just the words, but the reverence behind them. When he spoke of cherry blossoms in Kyoto, she helped the others understand that he was talking about beauty that transcends commercial value. More importantly, she began to offer observations of her own, subtle suggestions about how the businessmen's proposals might be adjusted to better align with Takahashi's values. Gentle clarifications that helped both sides find common ground they hadn't known existed. "Miss Carter," Kenji said during a brief pause in the conversation, switching to Japanese so the others wouldn't understand, "you do more than translate words. You translate hearts. This is a rare gift." Emily felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she met his gaze steadily. "I believe understanding is possible between any people, if both sides truly want to find it. And if they have the right guide," Kenji replied thoughtfully. The businessmen, sensing something significant in this exchange they couldn't understand, shifted uncomfortably. But for the first time all evening, their discomfort came not from panic, but from the growing realization that their success now depended entirely on someone they had never noticed before tonight. As the formal dinner concluded and the last details of preliminary agreements were discussed, Kenji asked for a few minutes to speak privately with Emily. The businessmen reluctantly withdrew to the hotel bar, their earlier arrogance replaced by nervous anticipation and the dawning realization that their fate now rested in the hands of someone they had completely overlooked. Alone in the golden dining hall, with only the soft light of chandeliers and the distant hum of the city beyond the windows, Kenji turned to face Emily fully. His expression was serious, but not unkind. The look of someone about to make a decision that would change lives. "Miss Carter," he began, his voice carrying the weight of careful consideration, "tonight you did something remarkable. You didn't just solve a language problem. You revealed something about character, both theirs and your own." Emily felt her pulse quicken, but she remained silent. Sensing that this was a moment for listening rather than speaking, Kenji continued, "I came to this dinner not really to evaluate their business proposal. I had already reviewed their financials and projections. I came to understand who they are as people, whether they possess the humility to admit limitations, the wisdom to seek help, the integrity to put truth before pride." He paused, studying her face in the soft light. "They failed that test completely. But you passed one I hadn't even thought to create." "I don't understand," Emily said softly. "You had everything to lose and nothing to gain by speaking up. You could have remained safe in your invisibility. Instead, you risked your livelihood to prevent a failure of understanding. That tells me more about your character than any resume ever could." Emily's heart began to race as she sensed the direction of his words. "I have a proposition for you, Miss Carter. I need someone I can trust, someone who understands not just language, but the deeper currents of communication. Someone who can help me build bridges not just in this city, but around the world." He reached into his jacket and withdrew an elegant business card, its surface bearing his company's seal in embossed gold. "Come work for me as my cultural liaison, my translator, my voice in rooms where understanding matters more than profit." Emily stared at the card as if it were made of fire rather than paper. "Mr. Takahashi, I don't have business experience. I've never worked in international commerce. You're just someone who chose courage when it mattered." he interrupted gently. Someone who values truth over safety. Someone who understands that real success comes from connecting hearts, not just counting money. Emily's hands trembled as she looked at the card. The elegant script seemed to shimmer in the chandelier light, each letter representing possibilities she had never dared to imagine. "What about them?" she asked, nodding toward the door where the businessmen had exited. "The deal." Kenji's expression grew thoughtful. "Thanks to you, they now understand what I'm actually looking for. Whether they can deliver on those deeper values remains to be seen. But regardless of what happens with their proposal, I've found what I came here to find: someone I can trust, to help me build the kind of partnerships that last." He leaned forward slightly, his tone becoming more personal. "Emily, I've spent 20 years building a fortune, but I've learned that money without meaning is just elaborate counting. I want to create something that matters, something that brings people together rather than driving them apart. I need someone who understands that vision." Emily thought of her cramped apartment above the laundromat, of her mother's medical bills, of the textbooks gathering dust on her small desk. But more than that, she thought of the dreams she had carefully buried, the passion for language and culture that had never really died but had been slowly suffocating under years of practical necessity. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Good," Kenji replied with a slight smile. "Fear means it matters. Fear means you understand the weight of the opportunity. Someone who wasn't scared would be someone who didn't appreciate what was being offered." He stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the city lights that stretched to the horizon. "Do you know what my father taught me about fear, Emily? He said that fear is like a map. It shows you exactly where your treasure is buried. The things that scare us most are usually the things we want most deeply." Emily joined him at the window, the business card still trembling in her fingers. Below them, the city pulsed with life. Millions of people pursuing their dreams, facing their fears, making choices that would define their futures. "What would I need to do?" she asked. "Start by coming to Tokyo. Spend 6 months learning my business, understanding how cultural bridges are built in the modern world. Learn not just to translate words, but to translate entire ways of thinking. Help me create partnerships that honor both profit and people." Emily closed her eyes, feeling the weight of decisions settling around her like a cloak. In one direction lay safety, predictability, the quiet desperation of dreams deferred indefinitely. In the other lay uncertainty, challenge, and the possibility of becoming the person she had once imagined she could be. When Emily opened her eyes, something had changed in her expression. The fear was still there, but it was no longer paralyzing. It had transformed into something else, the kind of energy that comes from standing at the edge of a cliff and realizing you've always wanted to learn to fly. She bowed her head slightly, in the Japanese manner she had learned years ago in textbooks that suddenly seemed prophetic, rather than merely academic. "Watashi wa anata no shinen o watashi no shinen ni shitai desu," she said, her voice steady and sure. "I want to make your vision my own vision." Kenji's smile was the first completely unguarded expression he had shown all evening. "Then it is decided." They stood there for a moment in comfortable silence. to people who had found in each other exactly what they hadn't known they were looking for. Outside, the city continued its relentless pulse, unaware that in one golden dining room, a life had just taken a completely new direction. "There's one condition," Emily said suddenly, surprising herself with her boldness. Kenji raised an eyebrow, curious rather than offended. "The businessmen, Coleman and the others. They're not bad men, just limited in their perspective. If your deal with them moves forward, could we perhaps arrange for cultural sensitivity training? Help them understand not just the language of international business, but its heart?" Kenji studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You see redemption where others see only failure." "Yes, Miss Carter. I think that can be arranged." As word spread through the hotel of what had transpired in the private dining room, Emily found herself at the center of a story that would be retold in hospitality circles. 4 years to come, the waitress who saved a multi-million-dollar deal, the server who spoke perfect Japanese, the invisible woman who became the most important person in the room. Rosie, her fellow server, and the closest thing she had to a friend at work, pulled her aside in the service corridor, tears streaming down her weathered face. Emily, honey, you did something tonight that changes everything, she whispered, crushing her in a hug that smelled of kitchen steam and honest work. "You showed all of us that we're more than what people see on the surface." The hotel manager, the same man who had once scolded her for helping French guests, approached her with an expression she had never seen before. Something that looked suspiciously like respect. "Miss Carter," he said formally, "I owe you an apology, and the hotel owes you a debt of gratitude. Your actions tonight, they reflect the very best of what hospitality should be." But perhaps the most meaningful response came from an unexpected source. As Emily was gathering her things from her locker, preparing for what she suddenly realized would be her last shift at the Grand Regency, one of the younger executives from the dinner appeared in the staff area. "Excuse me," he said, his earlier arrogance replaced by something that looked like humility. "I wanted to thank you, and to apologize. I spent so much time focusing on impressing Mr. Takahashi that I forgot to listen to what he was actually saying. You reminded me that real success comes from understanding, not from pretending to understand." He paused, then added quietly, "My daughter is studying Mandarin in school. She wants to work in international relations someday. After tonight, I'm going to encourage her dream instead of pushing her towards something more practical. You've shown me that knowing how to build bridges between people, that's the most practical skill of all." Emily's last night at the Grand Regency was bittersweet. The dining hall where everything had changed was empty now. Chairs stacked on tables, chandeliers dimmed to their nighttime glow. She walked through the space slowly, remembering not just this evening, but all the evenings that had led to it. The years of invisible service, the dreams carefully hidden, the passions slowly suffocating under the weight of practical necessity. But now, instead of regret for time lost, she felt something like gratitude for the path that had brought her to this moment. Every shift had taught her something about people, about service, about the dignity that exists in all honest work. Every difficult customer had strengthened her patience. Every long night had deepened her appreciation for opportunity. She pulled out her phone and made a call she had been both anticipating and dreading. "Mom?" she said when the familiar voice answered. "I have something to tell you." The conversation that followed was filled with tears of joy, of pride, of the complex emotions that come when dreams thought dead suddenly spring back to life. Her mother, who had carried guilt for years about Emily's sacrificed education, wept when she heard about the opportunity in Tokyo. "Go, baby," she whispered through the phone. "Go and be everything you were meant to be. I'll be here when you get back, and I'll be so proud I won't know what to do with myself." Emily's apartment that night felt different too. The textbooks on her desk no longer seemed like relics of failure, but like seeds that had been waiting for the right season to bloom. The acceptance letter from years ago, still folded in its wooden box, now seemed like a prophecy rather than a memorial. She spent hours packing, not just clothes and belongings, but dreams and possibilities she had thought were lost forever. Each item she placed in her suitcase felt significant, a symbol of transformation, of becoming rather than just existing. Cherry blossoms fell like pink snow as Emily walked through the gardens of the Meiji Shrine in Tokyo. Her new corporate badge clipped to the lapel of a blazer that still felt foreign, but increasingly comfortable. She was no longer the invisible waitress in a wrinkled uniform. She had become Emily Carter, senior cultural liaison for Takahashi International, a woman whose voice now helped shape multi-million-dollar partnerships across 3 continents. The work was everything Kenji had promised, and more challenging than she had imagined. She had spent 6 months not just learning the mechanics of international business, but understanding its soul, the delicate dance of respect and ambition, tradition and innovation, profit and purpose that characterized successful global partnerships. Her days were filled with video conferences with executives in Seoul and Singapore, cultural briefings for American companies seeking to enter Asian markets, translation work that went far beyond language to encompass entire worldviews. But perhaps most satisfying was the project she had initiated herself, a cultural exchange program that brought young translators and cultural liaisons from around the world to Tokyo for training in what she had come to call empathetic commerce, business practices that honored both profit and people. The first cohort included a young woman from Mumbai who spoke 4 languages, but had been trapped in a data entry job, a man from Sao Paulo whose expertise in Portuguese and Spanish had been wasted in a warehouse, and a brilliant woman from Lagos whose knowledge of 6 African languages had been dismissed by every company she had approached. Emily saw herself in each of them, talent hidden by circumstance, dreams deferred by necessity, voices silenced by systems that couldn't recognize their value. One evening, as Emily sat in her modern Tokyo apartment, so different from the cramped space above the laundromat, that seemed like it belonged to another person's life, her phone rang. It was Coleman, the executive from that life-changing dinner 6 months ago. "Emily," he said, and she could hear something new in his voice. Humility, perhaps, or simply hard-earned wisdom. "I wanted you to know that the deal went through. But more than that, I wanted to thank you for something I didn't understand at the time." "What's that?" Emily asked, settling into her chair with a cup of jasmine tea that had become part of her evening ritual. You didn't just save our business relationship with Takahashi. You changed how we think about business relationships entirely. We've implemented cultural sensitivity training for all our international partnerships. We've hired translators not just for language, but for cultural understanding. And our success rate in global ventures has tripled. He paused, then continued more quietly. But personally, what you did that night, you reminded me that the most important voice in any room might belong to the person who seems to have the least power. You taught me to listen differently, to look for wisdom in unexpected places. Emily smiled, watching cherry blossoms drift past her window like prayers answered by patient gods. The most important lesson I learned, she replied, is that we all have voices worth hearing. Sometimes we just need the courage to use them, and sometimes we need others to have the wisdom to listen. After the call ended, Emily walked to her desk and opened a wooden box she had brought from her old life. Inside was the faded acceptance letter to Tokyo from years ago, along with a new edition, the business card Kenji had given her that night at the Grand Regency. She placed them side by side, two different paths to the same destination, proof that sometimes dreams don't die. They just wait for the right moment to resurrect themselves in forms we never could have imagined. Back in her hometown, the story of Emily Carter had become something of a legend. The Grand Regency Hotel now prominently featured multilingual staff and cultural liaison services. The business school at the local university had created a program in cross-cultural communication, with Emily as a guest lecturer via video conference. More importantly, her story had inspired others who had been hiding their own talents, their own dreams, their own voices. Maria Gonzalez, a housekeeper at the hotel who spoke fluent Spanish and Portuguese, was now working as a translator for the city's growing Latin American business community. David Park, a night security guard with a degree in international relations that he had never been able to use, was now employed by the mayor's office as a liaison for Asian investment initiatives. Sarah Williams, a bartender who had taught herself Mandarin through online courses, but had never told anyone, was now helping local businesses navigate the Chinese market. The invisible workforce of the service industry had discovered that their skills, their knowledge, their dreams were not as invisible as they had believed. They just needed someone to show them that their voices mattered, that their talents had value, that their dreams were worth pursuing. 3 years later, Emily stood before a gathering of young professionals from around the world at the Global Cultural Understanding Summit in Singapore. The audience was diverse: translators, cultural liaisons, business executives, entrepreneurs, all united by the belief that success in the modern world required not just technical skills, but emotional intelligence, not just profit margins, but cultural sensitivity. I want to tell you about a night that changed my life, Emily began, her voice carrying easily through the auditorium. It was the night I learned that the most powerful person in any room isn't necessarily the one wearing the finest suit or carrying the largest bank account. It's the one with the courage to speak truth when it matters most. She told them about the golden dining hall, about the language barrier that seemed insurmountable, about the moment when she chose courage over safety, Voice over silence. Hope over fear. The lesson isn't just about language or cultural understanding, she concluded, her words resonating in the quiet auditorium. It's about recognizing that we all have gifts the world needs, voices that matter, dreams worth pursuing. The question isn't whether you have something valuable to offer. You do. The question is whether you'll find the courage to offer it. As applause filled the auditorium, Emily thought about the journey that had brought her to this stage. From invisible waitress to sought-after cultural bridge builder, from silent observer to influential voice. But more than her own transformation, she thought about all the others like her, the talented, the overlooked, the quietly capable, who were still waiting for their moment, still hiding their lights under bushels of fear and circumstance. Her story was just one story, but it was proof that transformation is always possible, that dreams deferred are not always dreams denied, that sometimes the greatest opportunities come disguised as the greatest risks. In boardrooms and dining halls round the world, in service corridors and break rooms, in quiet apartments where textbooks gather dust and dreams lie dormant, there are voices waiting to be heard. Emily Carter's voice had been one of them. Now, it was helping others find their own. Because, in the end, the most powerful force in any room, any business, any life, is not money or position or pedigree. It's the courage to speak when it matters most. And everyone has that power, waiting to be discovered, waiting to be used, waiting to change the world one honest conversation at a time. Sometimes the most powerful person in the room isn't the one wearing the finest suit, but the one with the courage to speak when it matters most. Because wealth can buy attention, but honesty earns respect. And as Emily Carter proved, even a single voice, spoken with truth, can change the course of millions.